You're about to witness a man walk into a dealership covered in dust, boots worn down, and a calm voice, only to be laughed at by everyone inside. But what they didn't know is that he wasn't just buying trucks. He was keeping a 30-year-old promise alive. And by the time he explained why, not a single eye in that showroom stayed dry. The glass doors slid open with a quiet swoosh, letting in a wave of dry Texas heat and the heavy scent of dirt and diesel. Will Carter stepped inside, his boots thudding against the polished floor. Heads turned, a tall, weathered man with sun-cracked skin and oil-stained jeans wasn't the usual kind of customer they were used to. His flannel shirt was faded, his baseball cap frayed at the edges, and the look in his eyes, calm, steady, unbothered. "Morning," he said softly, nodding to the row of sharply dressed salesmen. Chad Dawson, the top salesman with the slick hair and sharper smile, gave a dismissive glance. "What can we help you with, sir?" he asked, not bothering to hide his amusement. Will didn't flinch. "I'm looking to buy 7 trucks, heavy duty, all black, diesel." Chad choked on a laugh. "7? You planning on starting a convoy?" Will didn't respond. He just opened a weathered folder and began flipping through handwritten notes. The room shifted. Quietly, another voice spoke. "I can help you, sir," said Ethan Miller, the youngest on the floor. Will nodded. "I'm not here to waste anyone's time. I just need someone who'll treat me like a person. If stories like this move you, stories that make you feel, remember, and rethink, then hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. Don't miss the next one. We share moments that matter, and you're part of something rare here. It's not just content, it's a reminder of what really counts." Will Carter had never been the type to chase attention. Born and raised on the same stretch of land his grandfather once farmed, he grew up knowing more about tractors than textbooks. Life taught him early that dignity had nothing to do with appearance, and everything to do with how you carried yourself when no one was watching. He lost his father when he was 12, a tractor accident that left more than just machinery broken. From then on, it was just him and his mother, scraping by on crops, livestock, and faith. Will became a man before most boys learned how to tie a tie. By 16, he was running the fields. By 20, he had dirt under every fingernail and a back that ached like a man twice his age. But what he lacked in luxury, he made up for in loyalty. Over the years, a group of 6 men, neighbors, field hands, brothers by sweat, stood by him through storms, droughts, and debt. They shared equipment, meals, and even tears. When he almost lost the farm in the 90s, it was them who bailed him out. Not with money, but with time, labor, and faith in his grit. Now in his late 50s, Will had quietly built back everything he'd once lost. But he never forgot the hands that held him up when the weight was too much. And when he saw how life had worn down those same men, broken bodies, rusted trucks, dreams buried under bills, he made a silent vow. He'd pay them back. Not with words, not with money, but with something that would carry their dignity farther than their legs could. 7 trucks, all the same, all black, all ready for one final delivery of gratitude. Will's dream wasn't built on wealth or recognition. It was simple: to one day stand tall enough to lift the people who had once carried him. As the years passed and the farm began to thrive again, he quietly set a goal. An almost sacred mission. He would surprise each of the 6 men who had stood by him during his hardest years with something they never asked for, but always needed. A brand new truck. It wasn't about the vehicle itself. It was about what it represented. In a world where handshakes meant more than contracts and loyalty was repaid with silence, this would be his way of saying what words never could. Every time Will drove his old pickup into town, he'd glance at the dealership lot. Rows of gleaming trucks, untouched by mud or time. He'd picture his friends behind those wheels: Tommy, Ray, George, Sam, Leroy, Frank, each one proud, straight-backed, and finally driving something that didn't stall at the first sign of a hill. He began saving, slowly, methodically. He cut unnecessary costs, skipped vacations, sold an old plot of land no longer in use. Every dollar had a name attached to it. He dreamed of the day he'd pull into each man's driveway, hand them the keys, and watch as years of weariness melted from their faces. But then, life reminded him that even dreams born from gratitude aren't safe from storms. A late frost devastated half his crop one spring. Prices for feed soared. One of his barns caught fire during a lightning storm, taking with it 2 tractors and the year's stored hay. The money he'd saved, nearly enough to buy at least half the trucks, was suddenly swallowed by survival. And worse than the loss itself was the silence that followed. He didn't tell a soul. He couldn't. This wasn't just a financial hit. It felt like betrayal to the very men he owed everything to. For the first time in years, Will questioned whether his dream had been foolish, but something in him refused to let go. Because some debts, they aren't just paid with money, they're paid with honor. The fire had left behind more than charred wood and ashes. It left a scar on Will's willpower. In the weeks that followed, he worked like a man haunted. Sleep was sparse, appetite thinner than usual. Every time he passed that blackened barn frame, he felt like he'd failed twice, once as a farmer and once as a friend. His neighbors noticed the silence in his usually spirited voice, the longer hours he spent alone. Even his dog, Boone, stopped wagging his tail at the gate like before. Something had shifted in Will, something heavy. Then came the letter. Tommy Jenkins, the oldest of the 6, had suffered a stroke. He survived, but barely. Will visited the hospital 2 counties over and sat at his bedside for hours, listening to the beeping monitors and the soft wheeze of oxygen. Tommy couldn't speak well, but his eyes told stories, tired, weathered, but still kind. That night, Will sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot and cried. Not the kind of tears that come fast and hot, but the kind that leaks slow, like a leaking roof, until everything's soaked in sadness. His dream was slipping through his fingers. Age was racing him, and he was losing. Back on the farm, bills piled up again. He was offered a chance to lease his land to a development company. Easy money, quick fix. But he said no. The soil meant too much. His word meant more. One by one, the other men started to fade into the background too. George hurt his back and had to give up driving. Ray moved in with his daughter. Sam stopped answering his phone. Life was shrinking their worlds, while Will was still trying to stretch his. He started to think he'd waited too long, that his chance had passed, that maybe all he had left was a field of regrets. But each night before bed, he'd open his notebook, the one with 6 names on it, and stare at them. He wasn't done yet. Not until each name had a truck beside it. Not until he kept the promise he made to himself the day those men pulled him out of the mud. The following winter was the harshest Will had seen in over a decade. Frost clung to the windows like warnings, and the ground was too frozen to till. Livestock needed more feed than usual, but suppliers had hiked prices again. Every invoice that landed on his desk felt like another nail in the coffin of a dream he no longer dared to speak aloud. He stopped going to church, stopped attending town meetings. The dealership, once a place he'd glance at with quiet hope, now felt like a taunt. Trucks gleaming behind glass, untouched by the mud that coated his boots daily. He began selling tools. First the extras, then the backups. Then things he swore he'd never part with, his father's wrench set, the old hay baler his mother had saved up for decades ago. He watched each item go with a bitter sort of reverence, as if burying parts of himself in exchange for scraps of progress. Some nights, he sat on the porch with a glass of cheap bourbon. Boone curled at his feet and stared into the dark pastures. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow. The kind of quiet that comes after something breaks, not before something begins. One day, he found a letter in the mailbox with no return address. Inside was a photo, all 6 of them, Tommy, Ray, George, Sam, Leroy, and Frank, standing beside his barn nearly 30 years ago, grinning like fools, covered in mud from digging out Will's truck after a spring flood. On the back, In faded handwriting it said, "Brothers aren't made by blood, but by the battles they survive together." He didn't know who sent it, but it undid him. That night Will broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. In the dark of his kitchen, holding that photo, he let go of pride, of control, of the illusion that he could save everyone. He dropped to his knees, forehead against the cold tile, and whispered a prayer he hadn't said in years. "Help me finish this. I don't care how, just help me finish this." In the weeks that followed, he barely spoke to anyone. He'd work until his hands bled, then collapse into bed only to wake before the sun. The old notebook sat untouched on the nightstand, like a tombstone for a promise he was no longer sure he could keep. Hope had left, and in its place was only silence. But deep inside, something still pulsed, weak but steady. He just didn't know it yet. If this story is stirring something in you, maybe a memory, a name, a moment, pause for just a second, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. Someone out there might need your story too. Sometimes, a few words can reconnect hearts across miles. It started with a knock. One cold morning, Will opened the door to find Ethan Miller, the young dealership salesman, standing awkwardly on his porch, holding a clipboard and 2 paper cups of coffee. He looked nervous, like someone visiting a relative in the hospital. "Mr. Carter," he said, I just wanted to follow up. I know it's been a while." Will blinked. He hadn't seen Ethan since that strange day at the dealership months ago. No one else from that place had bothered to check in, but Ethan had remembered. "Brought you a coffee?" Ethan added, holding out a cup. "Black, right?" Will hesitated, then took it with a nod. They sat on the porch, the air sharp with early frost, the silence between them oddly comforting. Will didn't say much at first, but then Ethan pulled something from his coat pocket, a pamphlet from a local grant initiative supporting rural reinvestment in legacy farms. "I know you said you weren't one for charity," Ethan said carefully. "But this isn't that. It's an investment, and you qualify." Will stared at the paper for a long time. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't money falling from the sky. But it was a start. Later that day, he found the old notebook again. He dusted it off, reopened it, and stared at the 6 names. Something shifted, not suddenly, not like thunder or lightning, more like the slow lift of fog after a long night. He picked up a pen and wrote 1 word beside each name. Still possible. He made some calls, reached out to a cousin who ran cattle transport, spoke with a neighbor who knew someone at the bank. Slowly, quietly, Will Carter began to rebuild. Not just his finances, but his faith in what he could still do. And for the first time in months, he went to bed with something more than exhaustion. He went to bed with resolve. Will didn't return to the dealership right away. He knew this time he had to move smarter, not faster. The grant Ethan had introduced him to was approved within weeks, and while the amount wasn't enough to cover all 7 trucks, it gave him breathing room. Enough to buy time, enough to rebuild with intention. He started by restoring the equipment that had survived the fire. Then he converted a section of his land into high-yield alfalfa, low cost, high return. He'd read about it months earlier, but dismissed the idea. Now it felt like a lifeline. Each day had purpose again. He fixed the broken fencing himself, sold off his last 2 steers at auction for a fair price, even reopened a deal with a local dairy plant that he'd walked away from years ago due to pride. The money trickled in, slow but steady. With every dollar, he marked a line in his notebook, counting his way towards 7 trucks. Each name remained circled, a silent vow. Ethan visited once a month, sometimes bringing brochures, sometimes just to check in. Never asked for credit, never pressured a sale. Will came to respect him, not for being a salesman, but for being a man who listened. One evening, after closing a decent deal with a neighboring farm, Will drove past the dealership again. He didn't stop, just looked, but this time there wasn't bitterness in his gaze, just quiet calculation. Back home, he pulled Boone into the passenger seat of his rusted truck and said, "We're getting close, old boy." But it wasn't just about the trucks anymore. It was about showing 6 men who had given without asking that someone had remembered, that someone still saw them, and that, in a world where most people forget, Will Carter intended to honor them while they were still here to see it. Progress didn't come without setbacks. Just as Will was nearing his savings goal, an early summer hailstorm battered his crop. Insurance would cover some, but not enough. He stared at the flattened field the next morning with a cold numbness in his chest, the notebook sitting heavy in his back pocket. But this time, he didn't fold. He called Ethan. "Still got those quotes you printed out last spring?" he asked. "Sure do," Ethan replied. "You ready?" "Almost. But I need a deal. A real one." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Let me talk to my manager." By the next day, Ethan had worked out a fleet discount. Nothing dramatic, but enough to reignite Will's hope. They reviewed every spec together. Will refused anything flashy. No chrome, no entertainment systems, no leather seats, just raw, reliable power. Trucks that could take a beating and keep going. Then came the paperwork. The bank required extra verifications, the grant office delayed a transfer, and the dealership requested a formal invoice. Every step felt like dragging a plow through stone. More than once, Will considered scrapping the whole thing and buying used trucks instead. Cheaper, faster. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't a favor, it was a tribute. Meanwhile, word began spreading. Folks in town noticed Will was busier than ever. Rumors buzzed. Some said he was selling the farm. Others guessed he'd hit oil. Will just kept working, kept moving. When the transfer finally cleared, he stood in Ethan's office holding the receipt, hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of something long carried, now ready to be set down. "Schedule the delivery," he said. "All 7?" Ethan asked. "All 7. The trucks arrived a week later, lined up like soldiers in a row. Black, identical, powerful. Will stood in front of them in his work boots and weathered hat, arms crossed, heart full. It was time. The sun had barely risen when Will backed the first truck onto the dirt road leading to Tommy Jenkins' home. The air was crisp, heavy with dew, and the silence around the farm felt reverent, like it knew something sacred was about to unfold. Tommy's daughter answered the door, surprised to see Will outside with a brand-new truck idling behind him. Her father, slower now and moving with a cane, stepped onto the porch with squinted eyes. "What's this?" he asked, voice rough from age and disbelief. Will handed him a key. "She's yours, Tommy. Title's in your name." Tommy's hands trembled as he looked at the key, then at the truck. "You serious?" Will nodded. "You never let me fall. Figured it was time I returned the favor." Tears welled up in the old man's eyes, and his daughter covered her mouth, trying not to cry. Will didn't linger. He tipped his hat, hugged his friend, and got in the second truck. Ray was next. Then George. Then Sam, Leroy, Frank. Each stop was the same. Shock, disbelief, and eventually, tears. Years of hard labor, worn-down bones, and broken-down trucks had made them forget what it felt like to be seen, to be honored. And Will gave that back to them quietly, without speeches or fanfare. At Frank's house, the last on the list, Will hesitated before ringing the doorbell. Frank had been the youngest of the crew, always the loudest, the one who made everyone laugh when their backs were breaking. When he opened the door and saw Will standing there, he grinned. "What's the occasion?" Will pointed to the truck. "You." Frank stared at it, expression caught between confusion and awe. "No way." Will held out the keys. "Way." Frank didn't speak. He just pulled Will into a hug that said more than any words ever could. That evening, all 7 trucks were parked in front of Will's house, black paint catching the last light of day. The 6 men, some using canes, some with backs hunched, stood together again like they had decades ago. Boone trotted between them, tail wagging. Ethan had arrived earlier, unsure of what to expect, but Will handed him a camera and said, "Just record. No narration. Let people see what real thanks looks like." They shared stories until the stars came out. Laughed, cried, remembered the ones they'd lost. and for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel forgotten. Will walked Ethan to his car later that night. "I never thought I'd get to see this," Ethan said. "You helped make it happen," Will replied. As Ethan drove off, Will turned back to the trucks and the men leaning against them like they were 20 years younger. It wasn't just a delivery, it was a resurrection. Word spread faster than wildfire. Within days, the footage Ethan recorded made its way through town, shared on local pages, then regional news, and eventually across the country. There were no dramatic effects, no background music, just raw moments. A man handing over a key, a veteran friend wiping his eyes, a group of old men laughing like boys again. Comments poured in. "This is what real gratitude looks like. My granddad would have loved this. We need more people like Will Carter." But for Will, the attention meant little. He wasn't chasing fame. He didn't want likes or shares. What he wanted was to remind people of something deeper. That loyalty isn't a transaction. That promises made during hard times carry more weight than gold. That showing up for someone doesn't end when the crisis passes. It's a lifelong thread. In a world obsessed with speed and status, Will's quiet act of remembrance slowed people down, made them think, made them feel. He received letters from strangers, some thanking him, others sharing their own stories of friends who lifted them up. Some even asked for advice, not on farming, but on how to live with that kind of integrity. Will didn't reply to most. He just smiled and got back to work. Months passed, but the story never really faded. At the dealership, things changed. Salesmen who once snickered behind the counter now paused before judging a dusty pair of boots. Chad Dawson, once the golden boy of smooth talk, was quieter now, more measured. And Ethan? He got promoted, not because of the video, but because people trusted him. Will kept in touch with all 6 of his friends. They still met once a month, trucks parked in a proud semicircle outside whichever house hosted that night. Some used theirs daily. Others just liked to clean them on Sundays and sit behind the wheel, radio off, remembering younger days. As for Will, he didn't buy himself anything fancy. He still drove his old pickup most days, said it helped him stay grounded. But every time he passed one of those 7 trucks out in the fields or on the road, he smiled, not because of the money spent, but because of the promise kept. His legacy wasn't in the machines he bought, but in the message they carried. Real gratitude isn't loud. It's consistent. It remembers. It follows through. And it changes people. Not with noise, but with action. One truck at a time. So now, let me ask you something. Who's been your brother in the mud? Who stood by you when you had nothing left but hope and grit? This story isn't just about trucks. It's about the kind of loyalty that doesn't make headlines. The kind that shows up at 3 a.m. with a shovel, no questions asked. The kind that stays even when there's no reason to. If someone came to your mind while watching this, reach out, call them, thank them, or better yet, show them. Because promises kept quietly often echo the loudest in people's lives. And if this story touched something in you, leave a comment. Tell us who carried you when the road got rough. Share this with someone who needs to remember what real gratitude looks like. And don't forget to subscribe, because here, every story is a reminder that even in a loud world, it's the silent choices that carry the most weight. We'll see you in the next one.